started. Hi everyone, can you all hear me okay? Can anyone hear me at all?
Yes.
Perfect, great. Yeah, I've been told to recommend that people turn their cameras on and yeah, get involved. So I'm gonna be presenting today on some of the latest EV and storage market dynamics. I have quite a few slides. I'm happy to take some questions throughout. We can also do a bit more of a formal Q&A at the end, so do feel free to jump in or put a hand up. I think you can do that on Zoom if there is a question as we get going. As a bit of an introduction, my name's Iola Hughes. I'm head of research at a company called Rho Motion. Rho Motion was acquired by Benchmark Mineral Intelligence about a year ago now. And essentially what that means is we're now positioned as really one of the only market research companies and data providers for providing that full coverage from mine through to grid for the battery value chain. So extensive coverage in the raw material space from lithium, nickel, cobalt, and recently we've launched our copper market analysis as well. In terms of active materials, so looking at the cathode, precursor and anode space, of course, cell and gigafactory and new technologies. Lots on the demand market, which is where my background is with Rho Motion, tracking closely the EV and storage markets. We also look at the recycling side, and then on the energy and the grid side, looking at things like EV charging and renewables, as well as how storage is interacting with the grid. If anyone has any questions or wants to get in touch and find out more about Rho Motion or Benchmark afterwards, do feel free to reach out to myself. I'll have details at the end, or you can find our websites in the usual places, or LinkedIn or Twitter. Great, so starting off with an overall battery demand picture. So 2024 was the first year where we saw lithium-ion battery demand surpass 1 terawatt hour for the first time. This was a milestone narrowly missed in 2023, where we hit around 980 gigawatt hours. But really, we're in the terawatt era when it comes to battery demand these days. And despite negativity in the market and some of the headwinds that were in place last year, growth, when we look at it on this kind of scale, was in fact very impressive. The battery demand, raw material demand was very strong. So overall, a kind of positive year for growth. When we think about where that demand has come from and where it's going, really quite an impressive shift over the recent years. So, of course, back in 2020, whilst the EV market accounted for about half of battery demand, the portables market made up the second largest share. And then the storage market, relatively small at that time, accounting for just 7% of battery demand. Things over the last few years have obviously accelerated quite quickly. Whilst the EV market still makes up the largest market share and a very significant market share, really where we've seen the fastest growth has been in the storage market. And in 2025, we're anticipating storage demand to account for over 20% of the overall battery demand picture, which we'll get into in a lot more detail shortly. But just wanted to kind of set the scene in terms of where we are in terms of battery demand. And now we'll look a bit more closely at both the EV and the storage market. So starting off with the EV market, 2024 was a strong year for EV sales. Again, despite what the headlines may suggest, 26% growth is very impressive when it comes to any market. However, when we dig into the details of what was really going on there, we of course start to see some of really the differences occurring at a regional level. And I'd say 2025 was really a year of divergence in terms of growth and how those markets were evolving. So of those 17.5 million units, close to 11 million were of course in the Chinese market, which experienced very impressive growth rates. compared to, say, for example, the European market, which experienced negative growth for the first time, and the US market, which experienced quite modest growth. In terms of our outlook for 2025, we're forecasting over 21 million units to be sold. The beginning of the year has got off to a strong start. In China, we've got the extension of the NEV trade-in subsidy scheme. In Europe, you have the step change in CO2 emission regulations. And in the US, was actually a relatively strong start to the year. We think part of that in a bit of a pre-buying effect in anticipation of approaching tariffs, which, of course, we'll get into in a lot of detail in the conversation today. So thinking about the first couple of months of 2025, as I mentioned, year-to-date global growth rate of 30%. Unpacking really where that's coming from. I mentioned China's had a strong start to the year. We're seeing 35% year-on-year increase so far, and really impressive growth, particularly on the BEV market. In 2024, we saw a bit of a plateauing in terms of, or not really a plateauing, but a slowing, I guess, in growth in terms of BEVs in the Chinese market, with much of that growth last year really accounted to plug-in hybrids. However, the first few months of this year have been a bit of a comeback for the full battery electric vehicles, and seeing impressive growth rates when it comes to that market. As I mentioned, Europe was in negative growth last year, largely due to the removal of the subsidy in the German market. However, first few months of the year, we're obviously seeing some quite impressive growth rates, and we'll get into more detail on that shortly. So finally, just looking at those growth rates and how they compared last year and our expectations for this year. So as I mentioned, the Chinese market, very strong. Last year, over 40% growth rate. This year, we're forecasting 25% growth rate, of course, from a much larger base. In the European market, we saw that negative growth last year, and now we're forecasting 23% growth this year. And then in the North American market, last year, we saw a modest growth of 6%. And this year, this is our Q1 forecast, which was a 9% growth rate, which we may actually see come down a bit on the back of the impact of the tariffs and general uncertainty in the US market. So thinking about the European market in a bit more detail and some of the recent dynamics that we've been seeing. So CO2 legislation in the European market and the way that it essentially works is 2025 was really kind of a step down in terms of the target that OEMs had to meet in order for their average fleet emissions in order to avoid fines. So here we're just looking at our OEM's expectations compared to the targets which have been set for each individual OEM, and some of the deficits and surpluses that we are seeing. However, in the kind of more recent weeks since this has come through, we've actually seen the strategic dialogue on the future of the automotive industry, which has brought forward essentially the target compliance can be spread over 3 years. So what this means is that although there's been no change to the actual target level for 2025 or even the 2035 essential ICE ban, it does mean that OEMs can spread some of that effort over the next 3 years, and therefore avoid some of the fines which some of these players were likely to face. So we were seeing potential fines, in the region of over 5 billion euros for players like VW. However, with this new methodology in that the compliance can be spread, we anticipate that they should be able to bring that fine down and essentially kind of meet the target over the next few years. Of course, this is a bit of a difficult situation for some players. So, for example, we saw in the first few months of the year, several OEMs commit to joining a pool with Tesla. So the likes of Stellantis, Ford, Toyota, all committed to joining a pool with Tesla, which would have put them in a position to actually meet their targets and avoid the fine altogether. So, for them, considering they had done the work to kind of attain that pool and get themselves in their position, how on board they would have been for this 3-year compliance change is quite a big question. Thinking about the Tesla market and just noting on that pool that I just mentioned, Tesla was really a very important part of that pool which was formed. Not only was, the assumption that Tesla would, maintain its sales from 2024. Of course, there was an expectation they would have stronger sales in 2025, which would help the other OEMs within that group who produce less electric vehicles bring down their average CO2 emissions. However, in the first few months of the year, we've obviously seen some pretty negative results from Tesla. So, both in terms of their overall production or sales figures that we've seen come in from the quarter, but here we're just looking at their individual kind of country sales across the European markets year on year. Essentially, what we're seeing here. So, really just highlighting on this chart in terms of year-on-year growth for BEVs generally, some really quite impressive growth rates across the board. Germany up 38% compared to the first 2 months of 2024. Places like Italy up 63% compared to the first 2 months of 2024. However, when we look at the Tesla numbers, we're seeing some really quite severe declines in terms of those unit growth. Of course, there are a couple of things that we can take from this. The Model Y was being retooled, which, as we can see, accounts for a large amount of that market decline, that 54% decline. However, what we're ultimately dealing with now in the European market is a negativity around the Tesla brand and around Elon Musk, which is also leading to this decline in sales that we're now seeing across the European market. It does leave Tesla in a bit of a precarious position into how do you recover from this. There's whether it's an issue of Elon Musk, whether it's an issue of a lack of kind of fresh models, and people are almost bored of the Model 3 or the Model Y, does come into question a bit. You also have within Europe a number of other new models being launched, which are going to be more competitive than the Tesla vehicles. So it's going to be quite a few difficult months ahead for Tesla, particularly in the European market, where there is this negativity surrounding the brand. Here, what we're expecting then when we bring that all together is a second consecutive year in terms of sales for Tesla, both in North America and Europe. And this is ultimately taken from our OEM forecast for the year. So expecting that decline for the second year in a row for Tesla, despite the region overall set to grow. When we're thinking about the European market, again, in a bit more detail, number of interesting things to acknowledge here. So essentially what this chart is showing, the height indicates year-on-year growth, and the width of the bar is indicating the number of units that we're seeing come through. So just wanted to highlight some of those really on the left-hand side of this chart. So BYD with 195% growth rate in the first few months of the year, really ramping up in terms of their exports to the European market. Quite interestingly, this is despite the introduction of EU tariffs on Chinese vehicles. However, worth noting with those tariffs, they apply only to battery electric vehicles. So there's essentially a workaround by Chinese players selling plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So therefore, the likes of BYD have massively ramped up their plug-in hybrid offering to the European market, and therefore seeing that really impressive growth rate that we're seeing here. As we make our way across the chart, again, seeing quite impressive growth rates from the likes of Toyota, Renault, VW, even like BMW. So it's really, that Tesla number at the end is the one which is definitely the most concerning when we're looking at this. Several new affordable models are also helping out the European story. So the likes of Renault 5, the ID.7, and the Hyundai Insta are all going to help several of these OEMs. And really, these have been timed along with the step change in that CO2 emission targets. OEMs have known that this change has been coming for many years now and have been planning towards this. So really, this year is set to be a strong one for the European market. Moving over to the US market now. So in terms of looking on that OEM perspective, the start of the year has been particularly strong for the likes of Honda and GM. Honda, we're seeing growth from zero because ultimately the Prologue was introduced less than a year ago. GM seeing some very strong growth rates despite its low base, and that's really coming through from the Ultium vehicles. And then Tesla in the middle. The US, even within the US market, we're seeing pretty modest growth from the Tesla vehicles coming through. Thinking just highlighting a Ford down the end there, 7% growth year on year. And really what that comes down to is a struggling lineup and some gaps within their new models. This one I think is just worth highlighting when we think about it in the context of tariffs and how that's going to impact both the wider ICE market and also the EV market in the coming months, coming years. So when we consider the EV market in terms of where those vehicles are being manufactured, the picture for EVs is actually slightly better than it is for ICE. So of BEVs sold in the US last year, 65% of them were manufactured in the US. So, obviously Tesla does skew that quite significantly given their impressive market share and their manufacture in the US. However, 35% of it were vehicles shipped in from elsewhere. And there's really quite a big split there when it comes to across the different OEMs. So GM, Ford with manufacturing in Mexico, potentially will be able to get a lower tariff rate because of some of the USMCA compliance rules. The likes of Hyundai, BMW, Kia, and Toyota almost entirely relying on imported vehicles that will now be facing that 25% tariff level. Of course, even when we take a look at the likes of Tesla and take the Model 3, which is, according to certain indexes, the most manufactured in US vehicle that is on the market, you're still looking at about 25% of that vehicle which uses components from outside of the US market, which does mean that you could also be facing a higher price even for the Tesla itself because of that reliance. When it comes to the ICE market, there's actually an even higher reliance on overseas, particularly the likes of Japan and Korea, which both account for about 20% of the vehicles sold in the US market, which will now be facing those higher tariff levels as well. General consensus from a lot of people that we're talking to in the market is, there's this attitude which, what does this leave consumers with doing? Well, maybe there's a wait and see element, not committing to buying a new car in the next year or so, but wait for a couple of years, wait until things cool off. So certainly we're going to see quite a big impact in terms of both our total vehicle market numbers and then likely knock on the EV side as well. Another thing was just to highlight in terms of that kind of overseas reliance and how things go. So on the last slide I showed in terms of units sold. So of course, as I mentioned, Tesla's market share does skew that quite significantly. When we think about model availability, and the US is already in quite a poor position in terms of model availability compared to the European market and the Chinese market, with this chart here showing each car essentially indicating 15 different BEVs that are available in that market. We can really see the US is quite far behind in terms of just 73 models available. Of those 73, 45 are made outside of the US. And ultimately, with these new tariffs, it will mean that the introduction of new EVs to the US is likely going to be slowed further. And one of the biggest challenges in terms of consumer acceptance and buy-in to EVs is really around that lack of available models and lack of affordable models. And a lot of these affordable models, which we now see in the European market, for example, are made overseas or potentially would come from the likes of Europe that would now be facing that higher tariff level as well. So yeah, another kind of element of it that's just worth noting in terms of those tariffs. Just to mention on GM and Ford as well. So, they both produce vehicles or BEVs in Mexico. We see these as likely being USMCA compliant, so therefore being able to avoid the tariff level. And that's largely because the batteries are made in the US, or they're using batteries made in the US, and that makes up a large part of the value. That's a slightly different story to the ICE vehicles that are made in Mexico, which probably won't be as USMCA compliant, so would face some level of tariff there. Skip through a few of these just because I'm conscious of time. One of the other things I want to talk about is around, of course, the Chinese expansion overseas. So, over the last year or so, we've really seen a ramping up of Chinese brands selling their vehicles into overseas markets. Of course, the European market has been quite a big target, with 192,000 EVs exported to China, to Europe from China in 2024. But some of the other really big ones, the Southeast Asian market and Asia excluding China being a very key one, South and Central America seeing a large amount of ramp up of availability there, as well as several plans for vehicle production in the likes of Brazil and Mexico. North America, really that's talking about Mexico there. And then Oceania is an interesting one as well, where historically that's been a market that's been served by the Koreans and the Japanese. However, given their slightly slower moves to electrification, the Chinese players have kind of been able to come in there and offer ultimately cheaper vehicles than Tesla, who was really the only one offering EVs up until this point, and start to gain market share pretty rapidly. BYD, of course, leading this push, but SAIC and Great Wall Motors being not too far behind, and also planning to ramp up significantly over the next year or so. Thinking a bit about the chemistries that we're seeing and how that is evolving. So here we're just looking at global chemistry share within vehicles. And in 2024, we saw LFP surpass 50% for the first time. Really, that comes down to China's growth being, very, very impressive and growing faster than elsewhere. So within China, we were seeing several months last year where LFP was accounting for over 2/3, 70% of vehicles being sold. And then, of course, with China growth being much faster than the European or North American markets, it did help push this global LFP share up to over 50%. We're not expecting that to slow down anytime soon. We're expecting LFP share in the Chinese market to continue to grow. Really, when we're thinking about this chemistry, it's evolved in such a way that it is extremely competitive, both in terms of course, costs, but in terms of what it can deliver in terms of range, charging capabilities, and really starts to kind of squeeze where nickel-based chemistries fit into the mix. We do anticipate they'll continue to keep market share, particularly in the US market, where there is a big push for, of course, non-reliance on China, whereas the LFP supply chain being so heavily linked to China means that it will be a lot slower to be taken up in the US market. One of the other key trends that we've been seeing, and I won't spend too long on this, is around the high voltage mid nickel piece. So over the last few years, we are seeing increasing push towards higher nickel content chemistries. However, in the last 18 months, we've started to see that move back a step slightly towards more mid nickel chemistries, and really it's been enabled by a couple of things. The low cobalt price being a really kind of key one here, which means that in the past, there was a big push to kind of reduce that cobalt, both from cost side, but also some of the ESG elements as well. But with that lower cost that we're seeing now for cobalt, it does mean that some of the mid-nickel chemistries are being revisited. Additionally, with this movement to high voltage, which is achieved by electrolyte modification, you get the boosted energy density, which starts to bring you up towards where high nickel can be. Similarly, with high nickel, there were several issues around thermal stability. However, with the high voltage mid nickel, we can also start to avoid some of those. And overall, we're seeing many players exploring this. So, mainly in China right now where this is happening. But here, just listing a number of the high voltage mid nickel cathode producers who are in the Chinese market, and they all have significant number of offtakes with the likes of CATL, who are posed to switch quickly over to that mid nickel content in their cells and vehicles. So now I'm going to move over to the storage market and talk a bit about what's been happening in that space. So as I mentioned at the beginning, storage market has been growing at very impressive growth rates over the last few years, faster than the EV market and the fastest demand market. So in 2024, we saw over 200 gigawatt hours of storage deployed. This year, we're anticipating a 67% growth rate to just under 350 gigawatt hours of storage to be deployed in the market under our base case scenario. Here, just considering kind of our upside and downside drivers as well. So one thing that we do at Rho Motion is we track every grid scale project globally. So we have a database of about 7,000 projects globally and track where they are in their project pipeline. And if we were to take all of the projects for 2025 that are planned to come online in 2025, we would see over 400 gigawatt hours of new capacity just on the grid market. Of course, we expect many of those projects to face delays or even cancellations, which brings us closer to our base case scenario. But really on the upside there, what we're considering is a higher degree of project completion, which would push us up to a much more significant number. Other upside drivers, battery prices being a key one. We've seen some incredible declines in cell price and system price, which we'll get into on more detail shortly over the last few years, which has helped enable projects to be built in regions and in markets where it might not have been possible a few years ago. Of course, policy support and anything in terms of increased uptake in data centers and AI applications also are helping drive demand. And then more on the kind of residential and behind the meter markets, high electricity prices can also help be a kind of key driver there. In terms of our downside forecast, particularly for the US, of course, tariffs, and we can talk about tariffs shortly. In the Chinese market, we've seen a change in policy, which is actually likely going to push us more towards our downside market, downside forecast there. And any sort of kind of pullback in terms of renewables, which of course, is definitely happening in the US market, does have potential to slow down things as well. Some of the key things to watch this year, 5 megawatt hour systems really are set to become the industry standard. That's really a shift in energy density that we've seen over the last few years. Fierce competition for market share is really set to continue. This market is ultimately dominated in terms of cell supply by just a handful of Chinese players. However, you do have many Chinese players really kind of fighting to gain market share at the lower end, which has helped or really resulted in a bit of a price war and some negative margins that we've seen over the last few years. Thinking about the global markets and how growth is kind of growing, here, firstly, just highlighting that chart on the left in terms of number of projects. So not only are we seeing more projects come through and be built, the average size of those projects really is ramping up quite significantly. So in 2024, we really started to see a few gigascale projects. So I think it was about around 10 gigascale projects that came online in 2024. And really, 2025, we can see a large number of gigascale projects that come online, as well as a significant number of those 500 to 1,000 megawatt hour projects, which are due to come online. Thinking about some of the key markets, the key kind of theme from US and Canada, diversification. Storage so far has really been concentrated in the Californian and Texas market. This year we're expecting, or we've got several large projects due to come online, and more markets starting to open up. PJM starting to see a lot of interest in, and the likes of New York as well, seeing quite a strong project pipeline evolving. European market this year is expecting very strong growth. A large number of projects planned in likes of Germany, Italy, Spain are all set to bring some growth this year. To date, a lot of the storage has really been concentrated in the UK market, but yeah, this year expecting to see more projects come through. Saudi Arabia, again, very impressive growth rate, and a similar story to Latin America, and namely Chile in there, where we're seeing a lot of these really large-scale projects being built and developed, often alongside renewables, which are starting to drive some growth there as well. As I mentioned, the US storage market is heavily concentrated, so California and Texas, really where everything has been really pushed so far, but we are starting to see new markets open up with a few of those listed here. So thinking about tariffs and Trump administration, this slide is actually, the tariffs are changing fast, and what it means is this slide was probably made probably about a week ago, so these numbers are definitely out of date, but we can talk around it anyway. So I think one of the key things for the storage market, and something that is allowing us to stay positive about the storage market, I guess, is the fact that the investment tax credit does remain. I saw today there was a kind of a bill brought forward by a number of Republican senators who were making strong suggestions that the tax credit should stay in place for renewables and for storage. And I think a lot of industry players are feeling relatively confident, or at least hopeful, that the ITC will stay in place. The ITC provides very generous support for US storage projects. You can get 30% capex, which can be extended up to 50% if you meet certain requirements around either energy communities or domestic content. So assuming the ITC does stay in place, really the fundamentals for storage are strong, despite some of the downsides that we are seeing now, having pressure. And I'll leave the tariffs for a second because I've got another slide on it shortly. But one thing just to note, in terms of new grid projects that have been announced in the first few months of the year, 2025 has been significantly stronger than any year previously, with already around 70 new large-scale projects announced in the first quarter. And that's despite the negativity, the hesitancy, the uncertainty in the market. People are still committing to building batteries, and these are batteries which are due to come online in 2027, 2028. So there's strong confidence around battery opportunities and profitability in a wide range of US states that are opening up to storage. So thinking about tariffs, so the storage market is potentially one of the worst hit markets, I'd say, when it comes to tariffs. So for an EV battery, if you were to import an EV battery from the Chinese market, it would be hit with as if it was an auto part, which means that it would be hit with the 25% tariff and therefore exempt from the reciprocal tariff rate. However, if you were to import a ESS battery, you don't get that exemption, and therefore you're hit by the reciprocal tariff rate, as well as existing tariffs and increasing tariffs, which are planned for cells for stationary storage. So in last year, the storage market faced a 10.4% tariff. So that was the 3.4% general tariff plus a 7.5% 301 tariff. As of a few weeks ago, we were up to 30.9%. And now as of today, I guess, we're now looking at 140% tariff for Chinese cells coming into the US market. But why is this important? And ultimately, it's because Chinese cells dominate the US market. So last year, by our assessments of storage installed on the US grid, around 90% of that was using Chinese cells. So not necessarily Chinese systems, but the cells inside of those systems were coming from China. Next year, we'll be looking at an even higher tariff rate, where that 7.5% will increase up to 25%. And then here we're just comparing it to a domestic US LFP or NCM price, which suddenly looks very, very good. However, those domestic LFP cells, where they are coming from is a bit of a question mark. So really, that's a bit of an idealized scenario, and can get into more detail on that shortly, because when we think about domestic manufacturing, I'm really here just considering LFP manufacturing in particular, because that's what the storage market wants. You really are limited by what's available in the market. So this year we're expecting LG to bring some LFP manufacturing online by the end of the year. Tesla potentially has a small line of LFP that they'll be bringing online. You have AESC, who are providing Fluence with some cells for LFP. Gotion, potentially a small manufacturing line of LFP. But really the volumes here are much, much smaller than the demand that we see for the storage market. For at least the coming years. So, where does that put us in terms of the demand picture and where we're at? So what we're showing here is ultimately kind of system price index for a Chinese system within the US, and how we expect some of these players to weather some of this demand. So ultimately, US system prices have fallen dramatically over the last 2 years. However, within China, the prices are quite significantly lower. And what that means is that we anticipate that some of the tariff has the potential to be absorbed by these Chinese players selling into the US market because of the significant margin they're currently carrying in the US. So that could potentially soften some of the blow of these higher prices. The other thing to consider is that, because system prices have fallen so dramatically over the last 2 years, when we consider these tariff prices, and these tariff prices here were yesterday's tariff price, so there is a bit more of an increase on that now. Ultimately, it brings you back towards 2023, 2022 levels. Assuming the ITC stays in place, people were still building batteries in 2022, 2023, and there is strong potential they'll still be able to build these batteries with these higher prices, even despite the tariff in place. Other thing to note is we've seen a lot of innovation in terms of cell and system design, which means that for the equivalent megawatt hour, you're looking at smaller footprint, so less land costs and also less equipment. So when you're assessing the kind of overall project cost, there's also a cost saving there. And then finally, just to mention on this, in terms of the Southeast Asian market, several Chinese players have really committed to bringing online LFP capacity in Southeast Asia in the last few years. So the likes of REPT in Indonesia, EV Energy in Malaysia, both will now, be facing a tariff level, but as of yesterday, just a 10% tariff level, which suddenly looks incredibly good as an offering. So we'll likely see more of these Chinese players in Southeast Asia supplying the market. And then finally, just wanted to mention on chemistry choice for the storage market. As I've said, LFP really is the chemistry of choice for when it comes to storage. At a global level, we saw it account for 86% of storage installed in 2024, compared to just 22% in 2020. Really, why is it the chemistry of choice? China's dominance in this market. China accounted for over 70% of grid storage installations last year. That obviously does play a big factor into it, but then it really comes down to technology innovation. So, we've seen over the last few years a real shift in terms of the cells being used in storage. Really, the kind of industry standard now being that 314 amp hour cell, which is really optimized for energy density and cost and cycle life. And we're starting to see now players exploring and entering mass production of 500 amp hour and plus cells, which can further boost your system energy density and start to bring those systems from historically as low as kind of 2 to 3 megawatt hours for a 20-foot container to what is today industry standard at 5 megawatt hours, to what is kind of the future, which will be 6, 7, 8, even some players talking about 10 megawatt hour systems. Then the safety element and the cost element, of course, being key when it comes to storage as well. But what about alternative technologies and how we expect them to fit into the mix? Of course, in the US market, domestic content requirements and tariffs do provide an upside for alternative technologies. You have a number of US players working on novel tech that, if using kind of domestic content and therefore avoiding as many of those tariffs as possible. By increasing the price of LFP batteries from China, you do start to make it more feasible for some of those to enter the market. In terms of sodium ion in particular, the battery tariffs on China, historically the biggest concern was the battery tariffs. I'd say now there's obviously other tariffs which are a much bigger concern, but the battery tariffs are specific to lithium-ion batteries. So if you were to import a sodium-ion battery, you would be facing a lower tariff level. We're also seeing quite a growing flow battery pipeline, again, primarily in China for now, but starting to see more interest in this space. And any advancements made in the Chinese market around flow batteries will help the ex-China markets as well, as that supply chain does mature. And also quite a few players exploring hybrid sodium ion projects, which would allow you to utilize some of the benefits of sodium ion alongside your LFP capacity. So I've spoken for 40 minutes, which I think is a very long time. Happy now to take any questions if anyone has.